Hello, everyone. I hope you are all well. So, welcome to our session, to the seventh session of the DEMN lecture series organized by the Disaster and Emergency Management Program at Royal Road University. In this session, Dr. Jeff Donaldson will give a lecture on the role of social capital in community emergency management. My name is Mahmoud Fayazi. I'm the head of the Disaster and Emergency Management Program at Royal Roads University. But before going further, like always, I would like to begin the session with the fact that Royal Roads University acknowledged that its campus is located on the traditional lands of Lukwigan-speaking people, the Swangi and Esquimalt nations. Today, Dr. Donaldson will remind us the effective emergency management. He will, to remind us how the effective emergency management takes more than just government action. It requires a whole of society approach. Supported by previous research findings and his personal research finding as well, Dr. Donaldson will explain that communities with a strong social capital recover faster and respond more effectively after disaster. Besides, Dr. Donaldson will give us some hints about how emergency managers can design programs and policies that actively engage residents and public, private, and nonprofit organizations, helping to build resilience and reduce the long-term impact of the disaster. Before inviting Dr. Donaldson to start his lecture, I would also like to introduce him in a few words. Dr. Jeff Donaldson is a veteran, author, podcaster, and entrepreneur. As the CEO and principal researcher at Preparedness Labs Incorporated, he conducts research into the intersection of the social capital, preparedness, institutional trust, and public sector residents-facing preparedness communication. Dr. Donaldson has published books on personal preparedness, courses of entrepreneurial risk management, and he lectures in the Disaster and Emergency Management Program at Royal Road University. He serves on the board of the directors of the International Social Capital Association as the editor of the Journal of Preparedness in Canada. Thank you so much, Dr. Donaldson, for accepting our invitation to give a presentation today to talk to your colleagues, your students, and all the practitioners in Canada in the disaster and emergency management. Before going forward with your lecture, I would like to remind our participants that that we try to keep time for the exchange of the question and the discussion toward the end of the presentation. Hopefully, we will have at least 10 to 15 minutes left for the discussion at the end of the presentation. And please feel free if you have any question, comments, remark, leave it in the chat. I will make sure to read your question during the time that we will have at the end of the session, or maybe you can keep your question and they're raising your hand and asking your question at the end directly to Dr. Donaldson. Thank you so much. I stop here talking, and Jeff, please, floor is yours. Go ahead.
All right, Dr. Faizi. Mahmoud, thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm just going to share my screen here and kick it off. We don't want to waste any more time. And I'm going to do my best to complete as soon as I can so that we have, there we go, so that we have lots of time at the end to have some questions. And if we extend over the time, I'm happy to stick around. So the roadmap today, these are the things that I'm going to discuss, a bit about my journey, why I'm here in front of you today, what is a whole of community society, talk a bit about my research plans and my research findings and what I've been up to. Let's talk about social capital as a principal idea of what we're dealing with here today, and a couple of other interesting points that have come up from the research. So my journey, I am a proud Royal Roads alumni. It's a pleasure today that I see some of my former instructors on there, and it's a privilege to be here. I graduated from the DEMN program in 2015, and because I had a crazy idea, I decided to start a PhD 18 months later. Not exactly the best retirement present if you're thinking about that, but it was a lot of fun. I am a veteran. I am in the host of what you see over my shoulder here, which is Inside My Canoe Head, which is a risk, resilience, and preparedness podcast. We have over 355 episodes downloaded in 111 countries. I started the firm Preparedness Labs Incorporated in 2020 when we realized of how abjectly unprepared the entire Canadian society was for a significant disruption like a pandemic. And I knew that there was some research that needed to be done that was outside of what normal norms of research would consider. And I'll get into a bit of that now. Plus, it's very interesting. And if you have a question about it at the end, I'd be happy to entertain. Owning a for-profit research firm in the world that's dominated by academic agencies and not-for-profit think tanks is a very interesting place to position yourself. And as Dr. Faizi said, I'm on the International Social Capital Association Board of Directors. And for those of you interested, we're hosting the first ever Social Capital International Conference. It's happening in March of 2026 in Dubai. I hope all of you can just drop some coin on a good airplane and come join us there. We've got some pretty good speakers. But the things you see on top of you is if you're going to decide to research in an area, I'm a strong proponent is you have to be a voice for what you find. So I go to as many national conferences, local conferences as I can. I give local emergency preparedness presentations in my community to be that voice and that catalyst within my community to help them out. And as well, I just thought I'd throw the advertisement up for our next webinar in the Disaster Resilience Special Interest Group as part of ISCA that we're having the 25th, where we're going to talk about how leveraging social capital can affect families affected by or assist families affected by wildfire. And we're really concentrating this one on vulnerable families, families with disabilities, families with existing social problems. How do we help those people when their social system is exceptionally disrupted by a wildfire? And so when we talk about what is whole of community and what is society, it's important to understand that when you look at the anthropological literature, the sociological literature, and even to some degree the behavioral economics literature, we understand the society is organized in 4 areas, and each one of these areas are present to some degree in all human settlements as far back as we go. We're a gregarious species, we're tribal by nature. In the top right-hand corner, you see us. I mean, there are residents, which is a core component, obviously. In the bottom left-hand corner, you see government. Now, in Indigenous circles, that government won't be this big, large building. It looks different, but there is some type of governance structure in our society. In the top left there, you will see a representative of the not-for-profit. So residents who get together to form some not-for-profit organization to support a sector of society that's in need of some assistance. And the bottom right is your for-profit consumer capitalist organizations that generate wealth, that hire people, that provides the goods and services in our society. So all those are the 4 spheres that I'll speak about today. They all exist to some degree in every human settlement. But when we think about that, to try to bring it into the emergency management field, let's look at response operations. Every time that I've learned through my research, and it's pretty evident in most cases, that every time there's a disaster, there are 4 distinct response operations underway. Each one of these sectors of society will conduct own. So the government will conduct their mandated ones under legislative authority. You will have the corporations will execute their business continuity plans and assist their part of society. You will have the not-for-profits that will likely have to ramp up their services to their vulnerable populations. And the individual families, to some degree, at the individual family and neighborhood level, will conduct their own response operations. The problem that we have is that the way the model is designed, public sector agencies, the government believes they have command and control over emergency management. But legislatively and authoritatively, they only have command over public sector assets. They don't command the public, they don't command not-for-profit, and they don't command business operations, nor can they dictate courses of action to them. We have public sector resident-facing communications that unfortunately right now are dated on 40 to 50-year-old messages that are being systematically ignored by the public. And what we don't find, we find very little coordinated and cooperative experiences that happen on the ground. If you think of any recent disaster that you've studied or that you've been involved with, and you look at the ground and you think through it through the lens, the business, the not-for-profit, the government, and the residents are all actively doing their thing, but how well is that coordinated and how much cooperation happens on the ground? I intentionally don't use the word collaboration because that is an exceptionally high level of integration that you will rarely see in any event. And I've coined the hashtag that preparedness is where the response fight is won. And that simply means that all of the work, your success is directly correlated to the work you do left of bang. All the things that you do prior to the event are far more consequential than decisions you'll make after the event. So what are we up to? What are the research plans? So every year in January or February, I announce my annual research plans for the company. I publish it on LinkedIn of the things that we're planning to do this year. And we publish a Journal of Preparedness in Canada. It is not up at the top level of the journals, but it's a formal publication where we have some submissions. We've had it from for-profit firefighting companies. We've had submissions from the real estate industry talking about their concerns. But basically, it's a place where we can publish our corporate findings and our research findings in the general public and then get feedback on it. So in 2023, and I'll show some examples of this in a minute, we did a scrape of all the subnational and national social media. So the resident-facing communications the government issued on social media for the last 7 to 10 years. So we pulled about 600,000 individual parts of data off of all of the social media feeds, and then to try to analyze what that means. In 2024, we began our series on trust, social connectedness, and preparedness, asking a series of questions through surveys about the level of trust in community, social connectedness, and trying to find a better methodological way to determine what a level of preparedness looks like. And in this year, in 2025, next month, we'll be launching a research into the certain areas that have been affected by a disaster. So we're doing research in North Carolina for the hurricane. We're doing research in California for the earthquake. And we're doing research in Tampa area for the hurricane strike as well. And up around Charlotte, North Carolina, in that region, we're looking at areas that were affected by the landslides that went out. And then we're going to do a baseline 1,000-person study to compare across the population. And what we're trying to understand is the same things that are in the 2024, but does recent disaster experience change people's perception of trust in community, trust in government, and that type of thing? Our goal next year is to begin an annual Canadian preparedness survey where we survey a statistically significant number of people in Canada to understand the level of preparedness, their strength of social capital, their trust in government, and their trust in government communications. It's something that we can iteratively do going forward and repeat it every year, because since there hasn't been one since the 2014 SEPR by Statistics Canada, so we really don't understand these things in Canada. And when we find from that, the general thing, social capital, institutional trust, and preparedness levels are 3 variables that we have found that are correlated to increase community resilience. This is just an example of our social media findings on the left there. It just shows the frequency, the monthly social media posts, summated by region and by the federal government. There's 2 spikes there, one for a bunch of winter storms and then one for the 2023 wildfire season. The middle one shows the percentage of the population, of the served population, that subscribes to the government feeds on social media. So when you look at Twitter or X and Facebook, where most of the government agencies post notices, we're not sure what this exactly means. It's very difficult on social media to say that a follower of the Ontario government is a resident of Ontario, because I can't make that correlation, but it's a correlation that just means they have an interest in Ontario. So it could be their historical ties to it, their parents could be there. There's no way to definitively say. And then we created some word clouds about what the messages were sending. And that's an example of what the Western Canadian subnational government sent out on their public-facing communications. When we start moving to the last year's study on connectedness and trust, we wanted to know, how would you rate the level of trust amongst the members of your community? So as you can see, quite a number think it's very high or high. Near 50% have a very strong sense of trust. And then we ask them, how connected do you feel to your local community? And we see a similar, maybe a little bit higher, but a similar level of sense of connectedness or sense of belonging to their community. When we think about preparedness and plans, though, we ask them about how prepared do they feel for an emergency situation? And you can see some are prepared, very prepared, neutral, somewhat unprepared, or very unprepared. And then we ask them as a way, again, part of the idea behind this is trying to figure out new methodologies to test for preparedness. You know, having a flashlight is not correlated to preparedness. Having an emergency kit is not correlated to preparedness, but that's what the current studies do. We know that those things are not correlated to better post-event outcomes. So let's look to see what plans that they have. And so we gave them a long list, and no, that one on the right is not total loss of family. The ... means total loss of family home. So your family's fine. It's just talking about does the respondent have a plan or an idea of what they would do if their house burned down? Because that can be an individual event. It doesn't necessarily have to be from a specific large wildfire or a specific disaster. We also introduced primary income loss because, as we found in a bunch of our research over the last couple of years, that one pops up as respondents suggested crisis things that keep them up at night. So we like to ask questions. What are you worried about? What concerns you the most? What keeps you up at night? Those type of things. And primary income loss pops up. And we saw during the pandemic that wonderful people doing great education, doing great work for healthy companies lost their position overnight. They did nothing wrong. We also saw that almost every one of them had zero strategy for what they would immediate pivot to replace that income. If you look at the broad spectrum of the population and how many simply sat on their couch and waited for normalcy to return, but there was a small portion who pivoted to something different, and those people did exceptionally well in the pandemic. And we want to follow those and understand what it is that they had in place prior to the event, that they were able to leverage what was going on in the event and do better. I don't know the exact answer to that. These are the type of inquiries that I think are very interesting. Very interesting. And let's be honest, researching requires you to have some type of really keen interest in what you're studying. Otherwise, it becomes an awfully long haul. So when we talk about timeline and social capital, this is our other attempt at preparedness. So when we want to know how long could you shelter in place before requiring external assistance? And the idea behind this is, when you look at hazard plans and things like that, the research that we've seen tells us that trying to take a family to have, a flood plan, an earthquake plan, a wildfire plan, you're going to overwhelm them and they're going to shut you down. But if you look at what a family actually has the opportunity to do, it's a simple dichotomy, right? All that you can do is either shelter in place or evacuate. There is no other options for you, irrespective of what the hazard is. So if we assume that hypothesis is correct, then we're going to ask the people, based upon who you are, your family, what you have in your house right now, all things considered, how long could you shelter in place before you'd need to go out on the driveway, put up your hand and ask for assistance? What we're trying to do is see if there is a correlation as the government messaging changes from 3 days to 10 days to a week. Are we seeing a transition in people's preparedness levels, which would indicate, to some degree at least, that somebody might actually be listening to the government communications? One other thing that we find out very interesting is, and this one I put up intentionally for our social capital discussion today, is who do you turn to in a crisis? And it is exceptionally clear that family, friends, and to some degree neighbors, it's who we turn to. We don't turn to government services, not very much to religious institutions, and not much to community organizations. Who we really turn to when the world goes pear-shaped is our family and friends. So when we think about social capital as a concept, it's awfully hard. It's difficult to discuss. This is a logical schema put together that myself and the Institute for Social Capital out of Australia have done. When you think about the of social capital, it's your pro-social behavior. But like resiliency and like preparedness, it's one of these fields where there's quite a number of researchers looking into it. And I've got a quick list here. If you believe social capital is networks, norms, and trust, you're probably leaning towards Dr. Robert Putnam. If you think social capital is resources that it's embedded in the networks more from an economics perspective, then Dr. Lin. If you're looking at it, whether it's access to resources and power, you're looking at Bourdieu, which is more a sociological look at it. If you think it's about trust, Fukuyama. If you think it's about informal norms, Fukuyama as well. And the list goes on and on. There's no sense of this is a perfect definition of social capital, but in essence, it's the ability, capacity, and potential for people to collaborate, interact positively, and work together. So really, it's made up of your predispositions and connectedness. You are predisposed to some degree to assist others and create a gregarious bond. Connectedness is that opportunity. When you have the opportunity, do I know you? Do you know me? Do we have a way to interact? When you look at enabling environments and activation contexts, that means social capital is fostered in intentional places where people congregate. So they're often referred to in government as collision spaces or places where we would get together. So you're having a community event and everybody from the community shows up. The community event would be the activation that, coming together for a fair would be the activation context, but the enabling environment is the actual fair itself and getting people together. The key to remember about social capital is it enables the flows of other capital. We know human capital is the skills, knowledge, and training embedded in other humans. We know that financial capital is what it is. It's money and access to financial resources. And that physical capital is any built good that we may have that we want to trade off and could help each other. Social capital enables the flow of these capitals. And it's very simple to understand. If you think, if you've never met me before and I show up at your front door and ask for your lawnmower, the odds are not zero, but pretty close to zero that I get your lawnmower. But if you and I live on the same street, we might wave to each other. We may have even had a quick conversation at the mailbox and I show up to your door. There's a higher probability that I'll get access to it. So building a trusted relationship and a connected relationship between you and I enables resources, knowledge, training, skills, and money to flow better within society. And it's clear, the research from Professor Aldrich and his team at Northeastern University and some teams out in California, that it is one of the most influential indicators of better post-event outcomes is the level of connectedness and the strength of social capital within the different communities. So visually, if you want to look at it, this is what a society would look like. Bonding social capital is that those connections within a homogeneous group. So you can think about your family. You can think about a core group of tenured professors at Royal Roads. We're often members of a number of different one of those. Bridging social capital is if I have my toes in two different of these bonded groups, then I can be the link that keeps those two groups together and can help transfer resources. You see community organizations and business organizations. All of this is left of the power and authority line. Linking social capital is that social capital that crosses a power and authority divide. So this is the connection and the social network that exists between different community organizations and their city councilor. Business organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and the mayor's office. That crosses a power and authority barrier. And if you see where EM sits, for good or bad, whether you think it should or not, emergency management continues to remain tied to the government as a public service. And as such, it's across the power and authority barrier, which is an important thing to remember as we go forward. So like a lot of topics, people are interested in measuring. And this is very interesting because we just started up a new special interest group at the International Social Capital Association talking about scholars and researchers who are interested in measuring this, because when we talk more about it, and it's very like resilience and preparedness, people want to be able to measure a resilience level in a community. They want to be able to come in and provide some type of treatment and come back and measure it again to see if the treatment was effective. It's basic what we do in research. It's very hard to quantify, and because it's an intangible like that, what we prefer to do is examine outcomes. Those things which are present when strong social bonds exist. So for social capital, we know that to be social infrastructure. So the frequency and density of parks, communities, places, nail salons, hair salons, barber salons, and the frequency at which they're used, membership, the presence of community organizations, and the consistent level of membership within them. We look at voting in local elections. This is far more influential in to look at social capital than the say provincial or national elections. So we look at some communities will have 70 or 80% voting in local elections when the national standard is about 35 or 36%. And we believe that's a reflection of strong social capital. So what I do with that is we run surveys for trust in government institution and trust in government communications. And we run surveys on your sense of place, your sense of belonging, and the quality of your trusted relationships. Now, this gears towards the word trust, and I use the word trust intentionally. This is just a quick snippet of some of the scholarly articles that are out there on trust. It is a massive body of work. I don't pretend to say these are the most notable ones within the field, but they indicate that social interactions and relationships are key determinants of recovery, that neighborhoods with strong bonds better supported the evacuation of elderly, and that people have better post-event outcomes. We know that the vulnerable population has a more successful experience in a disaster when they exist within a population of strong social capital. We know that social capital promotes empowerment, influences recovery, it lowers risks, it increases resilience. There's a lot of secondary and tertiary effects that come off of communities and neighborhoods with strong social capital. But what does emerge is two clear truths. First is that trust is earned, it's not anointed by position or authority. And this is something when I present to, and I recently presented at a conference in Dryden, Ontario to the Northwest Ontario Forum, and I said, you can't assume because you're the emergency manager and you have this cool crested polo shirt and you're at a microphone that you hold a position of trust, and therefore by default the population is, number one, going to watch at all, number two, is going to consider your message to be accurate, in other words, you're giving the correct information, and that you're actually being truthful and you don't have a hidden agenda. My research shows that in Canada about 30% of the population will simply believe authority. They are ones that if you stand up with a position of authority, they will follow you. Now, that doesn't mean 70% don't. It's on a sliding scale. The next 20% to get to about a plurality are people who will listen, they will understand, they will look at it, but what they'll look for is a second source of information to verify that what the local emergency manager or the local wildfire speaker is telling. Are they really telling the truth? I need to verify it. Then you go down a whole different spectrum to people who believe that the emergency manager is intentionally hiding something, that there's a truth here we don't know of. They're not telling me the whole story. They're trying to what's their hidden agenda? Now, that's far more down the field, but it basically demonstrates that residents turn to trusted sources in times of emergency. We've learned this clearly through our research. If you're in a position where you have to communicate with the public, you have to previously establish the trust with the population if you expect the population to listen to you. And this is why I work on social capital to the extent that I do, that I work with municipal managers. And I'll give you a great example. There's one emergency management gentleman that works in the city of Mississauga, and he clearly tells me if he's in his office more than 50% of the time, he's not doing his job properly. Because as an emergency manager, his role is out in the community, not in a cubicle. So he measures that if he's not out at community events, talking to people in the community, building those relationships, building those trust, setting up social connections, then he's not going to be able to effectively execute his role when the balloon goes up, when the bad day happens. Now, a lot of regulatory and governance frameworks put a lot of work on local emergency managers. And I know this doesn't work in many of the rural areas where it's off the corner of their desk. It's a second or third hat for the volunteer fire chief in a rural area. I completely understand that, but the message is clear about trust. If you want the population to listen, it is your responsibility to establish the relationships and establish yourself as a trusted voice. if you want your communications to be adhered to, follow, and you want behavioral adaptation to happen. So when we think about moving forward, what do we do now? And this is the research-based advice. The tagline that I use at the company and in all of my postings is, we provide non-apocalyptic, evidence-based risk, resilience, and preparedness education. Jokingly aside, is we're just countering those folks that think the sky is falling, that think, we're about for imminent societal collapse. You can park all those people on the corner of YouTube where they belong, and that what we tell you is evidence-based. So when we put something forward, we're able to back it up with evidence. It's not what I believe, it's not my opinion, it's what the evidence tells us. And what it tells us about social networks and society is the process that requires the least amount of resources is to access the existing social networks in your community instead of creating something new. And there's a theoretical framework called social network analysis. We have a process built out that myself and the Institute for Social Capital in Australia has built out the how-to. Call it the operationalization of academic theory. A lot of great peer-reviewed research articles in this field talk about the things that community needs to do to build strong network ties. But there's a gap between that and the exact list of the 10 things the local emergency manager should do. Who should they contact? What should be, what's the script for their email? That's the type of thing that we provide. How do you first identify the social networks that exist right now in the community you serve? How do you identify who are the socially connected people? So who in society is of most influence socially? And we say that intentionally because often when emergency managers attempt to integrate with society, they go to the heads of organization. If I want to really talk to if I want to talk to United Way, I got to talk to the head of United Way. Well, our research shows that the head of an organization is not necessarily the most socially connected, right? So if you want to talk to Royal Roads about creating a social network in Souk, would you talk to the chancellor? Or would you talk to whomever does the community outreach? They're two different people. They're both important in the team, but who is probably better socially connected to the community around them and to the network? And that relationships matter. Build trusted connections is the key. Now, is it the secret sauce? I believe it is. Is it the key to success? Sure, absolutely. The question is, it's not quick. Sorry, the problem is it's not rapid, it's not quick. We're not going to finish this overnight. We're not going to create these networks in the next 2 months. It's about setting up these enabling environments to bring it together. And I'll give 2 examples. One, a community response council. And this is mirrored off one that exists in the Capital Regional District in Victoria, one that exists in the Wood Buffalo Regional Municipality in Northern, and there's one in Grey County in Ontario. So these are popping up around, but basically it's an intentionally created council where the key socially connected members of society are invited to sit down around a table. It's not a decision-making authority, because inviting people to decision-making authority, believe it or not, in the public policy literature doesn't lead to better outcomes. Excuse me. What we want people to be is in a meeting where they sit down and they ask the question, what does a disaster look like in our community? What would an evacuation look like in a community? What are your concerns about disasters in our community? It's not a lecture from emergency management. It's not run by emergency management. They are simply one of the organizations. And the best example of this is in Pemberton, BC. It's a study out of 2012 that was done by DRDC. It was actually published in a Swedish military journal. It's funny how these things find their way to publication, but they were looking at what qualifies and what defines a resilient community. And Pemberton, if you know the valley, it floods all the time. It has regular floods, and everybody's affected, from the small, medium business owner, the big industrial, the residents, the indigenous peoples, the First Nations in the area. Everybody is affected by the flood. And it's one of these realities that nobody has the money for large-scale mitigation. It just doesn't exist. So they created this community response council of 72 different organizations in the community, brought them all together, sat around a table, How are we as a body of one going to establish a trusted relationship and come up with a solution? And over time they did. They came up with a solution within the resources the collective community had to mitigate to the greatest extent possible. But that couldn't have occurred unless somebody set the conditions for the enabling environment and started the invitations to bringing people around the table, right? And there's nothing that'll kill it faster than PowerPoint. I know we're using PowerPoint today. This has a purpose. But if you're an emergency manager and you invite 40 people to a room and you pull up PowerPoint and this is who I am and this is what I do, there's nothing that'll kill relationships faster than that. You don't open discussions and create relationships by giving lectures. You do it by sitting around one-to-one in human and talking and listening to people's concerns. The Economic Recovery Task Force, I have to give credit to. This comes from my last group of students in DEMN 602 at the Capstone Project. When they delivered their oral presentation to the City of London, Ontario, who was our host this year for the Capstone, they were solving a problem that they had, and they had no recovery plan. The City of London had a pretty robust preparedness and response plan, but they literally had nothing in recovery. So they asked the students as their capstone project to come up with theories and ideas to help them develop a recovery program. This was a brilliant suggestion by one of the teams. The city absolutely loved it, and I checked back with them. They're actually implementing it. It's getting together those that constitute the economic engine of the city in a permanent group. It's not disaster specific, but how would we quickly and rapidly restart the economic engine of this community if we were affected by disaster? Innovative ideas came up through this suggestion. One of the most influential one was allowing companies and not-for-profit to open in areas that would have previously violated zoning restrictions. So if you've ever worked at a municipality, changing a zoning restriction is near impossible in some places. The regulatory framework to get through to do that is incredible. So they asked the city to put these clauses within their zoning bylaws to allow disasters to facilitate pop-up economic sites. Like you see pop-up shops happen in the mall for seasonal. Well, imagine that on a corner of an agricultural lot because the building just burned down that housed the company. And previous to that, that company would have had to found a free building in a properly zoned economic area to restart their business. When the city council says, no, we need you up and running, so we're going to let you start in a schoolyard, we're going to let you start in an agricultural zone, we're going to let you start in a residential zone. So this is a correlated discussion between the city organizers, the city planners, and the city policymakers, and the economic engine of the community. How would we restart? Those two communities never speak. They never get together to have these conversations. This was a brilliant idea. It's not mine. I owe it 100% to the students from the last iteration of 602. So the last part, before we get to the questions, is how do we mobilize a community? And I call it reality versus doctrine. The reality is, doctrine tells us to do a whole bunch of different things in emergency management. If we move over to reality is, for the emergency manager's perspective on the left-hand side, is having a local risk profile, understanding what hazards you're expected to. That's not a far reach, but in a lot of municipalities, that standard is not even reached. When we talk about preparedness level, and this is what I challenge my students in all of the emergency management courses that I teach, is if I was to put an avatar over here in the corner of the room and say, that's a prepared person, please describe them for me. Tell me what they know, tell me what they have, tell me what their skills are, because the definition of a prepared individual is going to be local specific. And this is part of our argument, a part of our persuasion, let's call it, to the emergency management community, is how you define a prepared individual is correlated to the local risk profile. So if I'm in Sook, BC, or Ottawa, or Halifax, Nova Scotia, or Iqaluit, how I define preparedness is going to be markedly different. So there's no doctrinal answer for what preparedness is. It's a local construct. And once you understand what a local construct is, You can then measure it to see the level of preparedness in your community. You can then, hey, we've got a gap in this one area that we'd like to fill. You can design preparedness communications to fill that gap. You can issue them for 6 months, and then you can go back and run another survey to see, was it effective? Did we raise the preparedness level? Were people adopting our behaviors? Because right now, when governments issue preparedness communications like Emergency Preparedness Week, I flog it to death whenever I have the opportunity, because I don't know of a single municipality in Canada that verifies whether anybody was listening. Nobody goes out there and checks the population and says, hey, we just issued all this stuff in Preparedness Week. Were you listening? Have you adopted any of the behaviors? Right? I have not met, and it doesn't mean I've seen everyone, but I'm up to about 112 municipalities in Canada right now that I've looked at and posed the question to, and the answer so far is a 0. Nobody goes out and verifies whether their preparedness communication program is effective. If you're not effective, I would argue, what's the point of doing it in the first place? Happy to discuss that in the questions. There's a concept that we introduce to the emergency management community called intelligence preparation of the disaster space. Now, I take this as a military veteran. It's called intelligence preparation of the battle space. It's before a military unit conducts operations in a community, it needs to know absolutely everything about it, from geospatial to meteorological to communication road networks to demographics to attitude to culture to beliefs. All of these things need to be known prior to conducting operations. I argue that the same thing should be known by the emergency management. To be able to take data from about 14 or 15 different fields and fuse them together to get a common operating picture of what your served community looks like. I argue with them. Some agree, some disagree, and I'm actually happy with that, that there is no person in the community who should know more about the community than the emergency manager. Right? Because how can you serve a community if you're unaware of the cultural sensitivities, the vulnerabilities, the needs? We could go on and on about all the things. You need to be able to fuse that together in a common operating picture. But I'll end with the number one findings that come out of our study at the local level, is that business community and corporate Canada is absolutely being ignored in the emergency management field. I believe there is an ideological barrier against the for-profit motive in emergency management. You see that in the construction of the national humanitarian workforce program that the federal government has. The very last requirement is you're not for profit. So if you're a for-profit company that wants to put several $100,000 into starting a relief agency in Canada, you can't get access to the program. And so when I went out and interviewed, and I'm up to about 65, 66 companies that I've interviewed in a couple of cities, is the resources that exist in corporate Canada far exceed that which exists in the public sector. And the prime example is, like I said, I was just up in Dryden, Ontario, giving a presentation about Northwest Ontario. When you look, there's 30 plus mineral mine sites up there. When you look the totality of the assets, I'm including EMS, medical evacuation capability, firefighting capability, heavy equipment, and trained workforce. Corporate Canada is about 7 to 8 times the size of the entire Ontario government, not just Northwest Ontario, but the entire government. So for whatever ideological barrier, we're leaving the largest asset for disaster response and recovery out of the equation. I think it's because of an ideological barrier. Well, the 3 things I found from corporate Canada that they were interested in doing or in having, they're seeking access to training with the emergency manager. They want to participate. I had one example where we had an individual from Enbridge come up, and they had a certain type of truck that equipment that emergency management in Northwest Ontario wanted access to. And the question was, how do I do this? Like, who do I talk to? Corporate Canada has no idea who to speak to talk about how do we take our assets and deploy them in coordinated fashion with a public sector response operation. So they're looking for training to understand emergency management and for emergency management to understand how the business sector operates. The second thing is they're looking for indemnification. No different than indemnification that's required for everybody else, the not-for-profit sector. And they're looking for cost recovery. This is something that everyone was clear. I have yet to meet a corporation that's interested in making profit in response. Recovery is a different animal altogether. Happy to discuss that. But in the couple of days of response operations, they're not looking for profit, but they are looking for cost recovery. Just like when a not-for-profit, when you pick up the phone and Team Rubicon shows up, somebody pays Team Rubicon their costs. And corporate Canada is looking for the same thing. And I'll end with one final example before we go to questions here. This is what I said to Beth Golding, an absolutely wonderful individual. She is the head of emergency management in the city of Ottawa, where I live, 1.1 million people. I live in the Western End in a suburb called Canada. If you total up the heavy equipment and the personnel working in the construction industry in Canada, it is larger than the entire military base at CFB Petawawa combined that you would call on the military for assistance. So you've got a greater force sitting in your community, ready, willing to help, but nobody's talking to them. So we're going to not-for-profits, we're going to the military for assistance when all of the resources, probably far more resources than is necessary, exists in the private sector. We just have to cross that ideological barrier and bring them forward. That's part of bringing all four sectors of society together around a table and enabling them. Because you have to remember, the not-for-profit, the business community, they live in the city too. They're residents as well. Their kids go to the same schools. They live in the same houses you do. They're not some foreign thing that we need to keep at bay in trouble. Anyhow, that's enough of my rant on the business community. Social networks equals resilience. It's something that is the underpinning of what I do and the research that I hold. I'm a member of the International Social Capital Association. I have the incredible privilege to lecture at Royal Roads. Inside my canoe head is my podcast, and Preparedness Labs Incorporated is my company. And with that, I will stop sharing and happily take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I personally enjoyed a very impressive lecture, and definitely, that you set the scene to set the piece for questions. I personally have a couple of the questions, but the privilege goes to our audience first to ask their question. Do we have any question?
You don't have to agree with me.
Yeah, or if you feel more comfortable, maybe I can stop recording, then we will have a very live chat and discussions. So maybe probably it's better if I pause. Okay, perfect. Thank you again, Dr. Donaldson. And that was a very, the impressive presentation. I personally enjoyed a lot this presentation. I invite all of you to have access to the recordings of our lectures, all our lectures, by having access to the websites, our webpage of the Disaster and Emergency Management Program at the Royal Roads University. And there you can have access to both our previous lectures, the recordings of our previous lectures, and also you will see our upcoming lectures scheduled. We will have a pause in July and August. We will continue again our future lectures in September, and then after, the continuing going on in October and November. If you don't have any more question, we can end the session right now and thank all of you for your participation.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Bye.